Hello, and welcome back to Dev Game Club, a weekly podcast in which two veteran game developers look at games from the past to discuss their relevance and impact today. I'm Brett Duville, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, a man now the villain, despite being the hero in the first game.
Tim Longo.
It was too good not to go back to the well a second time. You know, I just love that.
It's good to be a hero and a villain.
I thought about calling you the hyena and then having a little discussion about your laugh, but I couldn't make it flow.
Couldn't quite find it. But I'm very well aware of why you chose that intro based on our guest we have today. We are lucky enough, folks, to have a second Far Cry 2 guest that we've actually mentioned. Brett's mentioned multiple times, so we're very lucky to get him on as well as Clint from last episode. So I will give him a quick introduction now. Patrick Redding is a world-class game designer, interactive writer and storyteller, and creative and game director for some of the biggest franchises in games. Patrick started life, as far as I can tell, as an art and creative director in the web space for various big clients, as well as producing, editing, and directing within the film space. He started at Ubisoft around, as far as I can tell, and he should correct me later, around 2004 or so, maybe earlier, where he worked on such games as Far Cry Instincts, which we definitely want to ask him about, then Far Cry 2 within the story design area, and then later went on to work on Splinter Cell Conviction and Blacklist as game director. And so he moved from Ubisoft Montreal and Toronto during that time, of course, and then back to Montreal in 2014, where he joined Warner Brothers Games. And now, most recently, has released, congratulations, Gotham Knights as creative director there. Patrick has been active in the game dev community, speaking at GDC multiple times, as well as being on the advisory board for the Montreal International Game Summit, and was one of the top 20 game writers in the industry in 2009 from then Gamasutra, now GameDeveloper.com. We are super happy to have you on, Patrick. We really can't wait to hear about your fresh perspective on Far Cry 2 memories. So welcome, sir.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. It's awesome. I as I was mentioning beforehand, I just by happy coincidence had been following along with your first few episodes when I got the email ping. So it's really cool. It's cool to be able to jump in on it.
Yeah, it was good timing. And also as we mentioned, just having shipped your, probably this is the only time we could have gotten you anyway. If it would have been a month ago or something, it's like, no, that's not happening. But this is hopefully perfect timing. You sound at least a little refreshed, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Maybe not then. Maybe not. It's going to be about another month.
Yeah, that's
You're forcing it.
He's the console version of Far Cry 2 right now, with the gotta make it to the safe house.
That's right.
To save.
Yeah, he's on his way. So one of the ways we like to start, as you may know, is just kind of like getting, filling in a little bit more than what I gave in the intro about sort of your beginnings. Our audience likes to hear how people get into the industry, and back then it was a lot of different ways and stories on how you got into game development. And so, if you don't mind, just kind of giving us your quick version of sort of like how you got to I guess Ubisoft being the first one, but it sounds like you did a lot of stuff before that.
Yeah, I mean, I know you've talked to a few guests who are probably kind of in my generational bracket. So of course, there was kind of a lack of formal game design education anyway at that point. And I went to university ostensibly to study engineering and then physics. I actually have a physics degree, and weirdly, and
wow.
And in the course of earning that, I like did everything in my power to avoid any kind of formal computer science education. Which is funny because like I'm of that generation where like our parents, brought home, in my case, in like an Apple IIe in the early 80s, and I immediately started like, getting like begging them to get me those books that had like 20 games that you could code in Apple Basic kind of thing. And that was like my exposure to game development, literally for decades until I actually did it. And then, so I was not like, I was interested in computers as a tool, and I was definitely like interested in computers for things like art and animation and writing stories and stuff of that sort. But I had no sense that I was going to be good at programming, for example, at software development, and probably almost no sense that like what role that had to play in game development, other than kind of a vague sense of it. So I went and earned a physics degree, and I'd say like the main benefit of having a science education is that you are taught to look at problems in kind of formal ways, try to look for metaphors that you can use to solve problems based on what worked on other kinds of problems, right? Like once you get to a certain stage in physics education, it's kind of all that. And that was kind of like a weird stealth tool that I didn't know I had for a while, right? And then I kind of quickly realized I didn't want to be in science, like as a profession, as an academic, but I started getting really interested in things like media and how media was evolving, because it was I'm old enough that it was right at the cusp of when people started to talk about things like hypertext and hypermedia. Like there was an internet, but I don't even know if there was a web 1.0 at that point. But I was hearing about it, and I was taking like weird courses in like rhetoric and orality and literacy related to this stuff. And there was nothing. That was what you took, right? There was nothing. So then, and then weirdly, when I graduated, like, because I had done a bunch of work in like publishing and illustration and that kind of thing, I actually just ended up like in a weird, lengthy detour through the world of like print design and advertising. And again, self-taught, like I was working with people who had gone to art school and had formal training in graphic design, which was absolutely a thing you could go and get a degree in. But I was just kind of like winging it. And then ultimately I was lucky in the sense that it was the very beginnings of kind of web development started to happen kind of around that time in the sort of mid 90s. And I ended up working with some people that had a startup and had been, they were like traditional multimedia developers. So they were doing like interactive design and some things that had a kind of game layer to them, but only kind of very, very superficially. And of course we were all, avid players of video games at that point. So I was working in interactive media and then at various points was like doing things that were more or less entertainment like, and then sometimes working on film production and short film editing in particular, some writing. And in the course of that was, I had started playing like tabletop role-playing games with my friends in Vancouver, which included, among other people, Clint. So he and I kind of knew each other from back in that period. And so a lot of our earliest conversations about games and game design and game systems and all of that stuff were just like built on the back of a bunch of tabletop RPG work that we were, not work, but fun that we were having. And we were playing we were playing very little Dungeons and Dragons, but we were playing a lot of GURPS, which is like the Steve Jackson generic role-playing game system.
Yeah. And
then we started, and we had a friend whose older brother had developed an entire system from scratch, and we were like kind of helping to play test that. So, it was weird. It was like we had this weird little culture of like amateur tabletop games people that were interested in the design without really having a word for any of it, And, but, we spent a lot of time like debating like what kind of probability model we should be using for certain kinds of systems in the game, like if you're simulating, combat or whatever. So, and so it was kind of odd that we were like essentially training ourselves to think about those things without realizing what we were training ourselves to do, in an odd way. And at that time, like Clint was writing like literary, he was writing short stories and novels and screenplays, and I was storyboarding and editing and doing all this other work. So like we were messing around in all of these like game dev adjacent transferable skill sets And then, as I think Clint mentioned on your last installment, it was just kind of in the midst of all that while he was working in Unreal and sort of playing with the kind of modding community around Unreal and building really cool levels for that he heard about Ubisoft. And at the time, like I was like deep into like digital agency stuff. Like I was working for a company called Blast Radius, which had clients that were in the video game space, but I was very much like on the marketing side of that. And also editing movies and helping to produce stuff. And I was pulling like insane hours across like 3 different gigs. And at some point, like Clint had left to go to Ubi, and he kind of pinged me and said, listen, like I know how much you work, like why don't you just work that many hours, but for one employer instead of 3, right? And that kind of triggered the conversation and got me thinking about like, well, what is the state of games, and is there something there for me to do, and so like I went out and I bought myself an Xbox because I think at the time I had a PS2 and and the Xbox was relatively new, and I got a hold of his game, Splinter Cell, because he had sort of just shipped it, and I was kind of excited to see what his game was like. And so I played that and started thinking about it. And he, we talked, and he said, like, so, like, what would you change? Like, if you were going to change anything about the storytelling of that game, what would you do differently, right? And so we started talking about, like, well, there's some cool moments in there, but like we could embed some narrative in the environment this way, and so we started like storyboarding things and put stuff together. And so it was really with his encouragement that I sort of sent in a reel and showed, the reel included like a bunch of like commercial work and stuff that I had done and other things. And then also included some, like some of the short film work that he and I had done. And then had literally like I think it had some animatics or some boards that I had put together with sort of a written treatment based on the first Splinter Cell. And that got me a first meeting with him. And at the time, I think it was a Greg Goby, who was like the Ubisoft Montreal sort of local editorial or local head of creative. And so, we had a couple meetings, and I was able to relocate to Toronto temporarily, to the branch office of the place I was working. And then, went out to Montreal and hung out and socialized with Clint and some other people, and then had a couple more meetings. And then they said, well, yeah, how'd you like to come in on contract and help us out with some game narrative stuff? And so I did that. And like on day one, like he kind of, I think Greg kind of pointed out onto the floor just outside his office where, as it turns out, the Far Cry Instincts team was working on trying to do a port of the original Far Cry to console. And at the time, I think they were still planning to get it out on Xbox and on PS2, believe it or not. And he said, okay, I'm going to introduce you to somebody. And he brings in a guy named Jeff Haddam, who has since gone on to found a studio in Montreal called Took, which is now known as Invoke. They just changed their name, but they're a Hasbro owned studio that makes Dungeons and Dragons.
They did the Dark Alliance, right? The Dark Alliance remake. Yeah.
And Jeff comes in, and like I don't know him, and he sure as hell doesn't know me. And Greg proceeds to inform him, this is Pat. He's gonna be helping you with your non-interactive cutscenes, and this guy's kind of looking at me like, who the hell are you?
Wow, and that's quite an introduction to your boss or something.
I can say this only without any trepidation, only because Jeff and I, like, we actually had a really good time working together, and he and I have since become, friends. Like, I still occasionally chat with him, but it was, and I remember going back to like the desk that they had assigned me, and the first thing I did was like, they had sort of shown me how email worked and what my email address was, and I like got on there and found his email address, and it instantly sent him an email. Went, okay, I really hope I really hope that wasn't like the worst possible introduction I could have had.
Wow.
I sort of apologized for the abruptness of it, but because I was, just learning how things work there. And I said, listen, I just want to be I will literally do whatever you need doing. You tell me how what's useful. I will do that. I'm not gonna, I wasn't looking to be a bull in a china shop on my first day. Right. they had, so what they did, they stuck me in a room for like 3 days and had me play the original Far Cry from beginning to end. And I did that and just kind of took notes and tried to get a sense of the game's kind of narrative. And then I started having meetings with Jeff and a couple of the other people. It turned out there was like these two dudes that were like, had been testers probably 2 weeks earlier or something, and had now been told, you guys are now scripted events integrators. And, they knew enough about the engine they could do that. And so they were introduced to me as like, these are the two guys that are going to be integrating all of the scripted events in the game. So you sit next to them.
Wow.
And I was like, okay, like it was rock and roll, right? Like,
right. So throw you into the deep end, like, good luck kind of thing.
Yeah. And then eventually, like, they assigned a producer. In fact, I think what literally happened was they canceled the PS2 version of the SKU of the game and said, we're just doing Xbox. And then one of the producers who had been working on that came over, and they said, you're going to be now the producer in charge of all the scripted events. And so I met him, and it's funny, I still know that guy, and we're still kind of in touch, and he still does work in Montreal, Nick A. Pair, and so suddenly now we were a team of four. And so then I think the writer, the original script had been written or was being written by Richard Dansky, who's I think still, or at least until recently, was like the lead Clancy writer for the longest time down at Red Storm. He's a guy with a lot of tabletop role RPG writing pedigree. He worked on like a bunch of the White Wolf games. He's a novelist. And I went on to work with Richard on both of the Splinter Cells that I did. But so Richard had done a kind of like essentially a full pass on the script based on a restructuring that they were going to do from the original Far Cry. And so I kind of was like working with his script as a starting point. But I barely got to know the guy. Like, I think I sent him one or two emails and then was instructed to like, just pretty much do whatever it took. It was kind of like, you're not beholden to anything that's currently on paper, but just, do what you need to do in order for it to fit the game that we're making now.
Yeah, and so I was trying to remember, and I was doing a little bit of reading on this before we got on, but I had forgotten that Instincts was kind of came back to me. That was the console port, but it was almost like not a remake, but it was like my impression was especially
a lot had to change.
Yeah, there was like a lot of restructuring and stuff. And so can you talk a little bit about that? Like, that migration.
Can I give a little context, Tim? So folks are like, so that was 2004.
Yeah.
And that was the last, that was the last year of the original Xbox, because in 2005, the 360 came out, and then the PS3, I guess, the year after that. So it would have been late in the cycle. So PCs, especially back then, were going gangbusters in terms of performance. There was just, the doubling, every 18 months was in full force. It probably was faster than that. So squeezing something down onto a PS2 that was built for a PC in 2004 was not an easy task. I mean, we basically bailed on that for Republic Commando as well, for the same reason. So just to give a little technical context for why you would do that.
It's a familiar story for sure.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, it would have been a tall order for most PC games, but never mind a game that was literally being used as like for benchmarking, like your crazy gaming rigs, right? And so ultimately, like the core concept from the original Far Cry of, Jack Carver, rogue tour boat operator, ends up like marooned on essentially the island of Dr. Moreau, kind of deal, was preserved. But, the structure of the game, which was already kind of what they called like a string of pearls, right? It's like an action bubbles connected by sort of corridors of dense kind of jungle canyon path, right? We had to be refactored in order to support the sort of streaming solution that was possible on the Xbox. And so, which wouldn't necessarily have altered every aspect of the game. But I mean, strictly speaking, like, you couldn't have delivered on a lot of the things that were present in the original. So like in classic early 2000s game development fashion, of course, the team gets a hold of it and they want to reinvent the wheel. So, so I mean, I think probably there was also an element of just like, oh man, we can totally do like something different. So, anyway, so that sort of proceeded for a while. And I mean, in hindsight, it was no time at all, right? Like compared to the development cycles that we're going through. But like, there was a moment where we were instructed to kind of not go back all the way to the drawing board, but like the kind of message from UB editorial in Paris was, you guys are missing something. Like you're missing some kind of hook, some kind of that kind of Ubisoft special sauce that's going to like really make this thing sort of hold together. And it's funny to think back that they put that much thought into it, given that, as you say, it was like one of the last shooters of that generation. I think the other shooter that kind of came out in that time frame was Black, right? Which was like pretty cool because it was all about the destructible cover and that stuff. And so we kind of, like, me and JF Dugas, who's the creative director at Eidos Montreal, which now has a different name. I don't remember what it is. They just changed it. But they used the creative director on Guardians of the Galaxy most recently, and before that on the Deus Ex series. And so he was he had been the lead game designer, and then Jeff left, and JF became the new creative director for all intents and purposes. And so it was us two, and I think like the lead level designer maybe, and the lead, I can't remember, I think the art director, and we just sort of had to go into a room for a week and kind of tear apart the blueprint of the game, like the kind of chronology, what at UB they call the rational level design of the game. Kind of each, when you think about like the kind of timeline and bricks of gameplay based on ingredient, we had to sort of tear that apart, and retaining all of the work and all of the settings and all the locations and all that stuff, had to kind of piece it back together and define a flow and then come up with a new scenario for it, which is insane. Like, to think about doing that now, given where we were, is like, you just wouldn't do it, but we did. And yeah.
So how long did you say, how far into this was toward the end of production then? Or?
I mean, I want to say we had already delivered an FP, like a fully playable, and then we were going to end up delivering another one, right? So it was kind of, it was pre-alpha, but it was still like, quite far. Yeah, like there were people who had been doing tons of work on it, and so at that moment, I went from being what was basically a camera designer, like a guy that was, like that was the title they had given me to start, which was really like, you're going to go in and, and I was using my storyboarding skills and my kind of basic cinematic, the language of cinema to like figure out how to embed cool moments in this game. And I'm sure I was doing kind of a weird job of it because I was still thinking about this stuff a lot, like cinematically, even though it was a game where you could be wandering around and hitting trigger volumes from different directions, right? So I was doing a ton of storyboarding because it was the best way for me to avoid designing the team into a bad corner. So I would produce storyboards, and usually like top-down diagrams based on player position, and then I would get into a room with the two integrators that I was mentioning, and they would sort of help vet my design assumptions. They would say, they'd let me know, oh, like what you're talking about is going to be hard for us to do that reliably with, the tools that we have. And so I would go back and revise those. So it was cool because I was getting this very bottom up experience. But then all of a sudden I was told, okay, drop all that. You're going away for a week with, these guys. And then you're gonna, once it's plotted out, you're gonna write it, because I had rewritten a bunch of scenes already, so they knew I could do it. But
Wow.
I hadn't anticipated that was going to be my other responsibility, was writing the script for the game. So I ended up doing. Yeah. And that was me
you
becoming
get thrown into the deep end. Like, here you go.
Yeah.
We're totally revamping everything. And by the way, you're writing it.
Yeah. And so that's how a first time camera designer ended up becoming a narrative designer on that.
Well, it's like, we talk about field promotions, I think even with Clint and just like, especially with success, breeding success or what have you, where, you're doing a good job at the stuff that they asked you to do and keep doing that. And there's like, well, let's give them more and let's give them more. And that unfortunately can sometimes be a way that some groups will take advantage of people, I think, as well. But, it's also opportunity too, right? If you grab onto it and then, work. Yeah.
I mean, it was definitely like one of those points in my life where I actually was willing to just trade sleeplessness for advancement. You know what I mean? Like just like, because the amount of stuff I had to learn was almost infinite. So it was literally one of the few situations where any time spent on it was teaching me something or making me better. I wasn't quite at that stage of like rapidly diminishing returns like I was later.
Yeah. Where we all get to, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what's the Far Cry 2 came after Instincts for you, right? Is that correct?
I mean, again, this is how crazy the tempo was, right? We shipped Instincts. By the time Instincts shipped, I had both committed to joining Far Cry 2 because Clint was already kind of putting his team together as the narrative designer, and had started working on what became Far Cry Instincts Evolution, which was it was like a 1.5.
Yeah.
But like a retail 1.5, right? And so we made this weird micro sequel to Instincts in between Instincts and Far Cry 2. That took about, I think my involvement on it was less than a year. And the good part of it was they brought me in at the very, very start. So I was essentially responsible for blueprinting it. And took, because we had built Instincts, we kind of knew what our pipeline was for it. We knew what the tools were like. We were not taking parts and building a game out of them. We were able to start from scratch with a lot of it in terms of the like mission design and location settings design and all that, some of the enemy archetypes that we were creating. And also, in Instincts, we had established a whole bunch of this player fantasy very late. Like if you think about the Far Cry on PC, Carver goes to this island, fights a bunch of mercenaries, discovers that they are, that this mad scientist is mutating people, fights and mutating like animals and people, and fights them, and then the game ends, right? There's like a big final section that's mostly in bunkers, and that's not outside anymore, and then the game is done. And in Instincts, we added the hook that Paris had been asking about, was this idea that we would give the player abilities. Like we introduced that concept of like feral powers. Right?
Yeah.
And again, it's insane to think, but I think a lot of the underlying gameplay work had been done to support that. And they knew that, because we weren't as open the game, they would have to have some other mechanics that would help add depth to it. So my job on the narrative side was to come up with a kind of a fiction or a mythology around what those were. And when I joined, it was still a bit of a pastiche of a couple different things. And so we came up with this idea of like, let's make it all about them, like they're accessing like, atavistic parts of your DNA or something to give you these animal abilities. And so that was that was the angle. That was my big contribution to the story. And so then when we did evolution, we were saying, okay, well, now we have a little bit of light mythology. Now let's build on that. So we came up with some other stuff. Like, what if there were other people that had learned how to do that? And now you have to go to an island full of those people, and they're not mindless zombies. They're like humans with superpowers. And so you have to figure out how to fight them. So, and so we did this it's all very video game circa 2005, right? So
yeah. Well, it's going to be. I think it's going to be interesting to contrast with Far Cry 2 when we get there too, right? Because there is such a big shift.
Yeah, and like for me personally, the big difference was I hired a writer for that, and we brought someone in externally. I just did narrative design on it. I don't think I wrote any of the dialogue. And I think I did a little bit of the basic kind of scripted events planning and kind of established what the objectives were of each of the cinematics and in-game scripted events, but had another designer that came in and did storyboarding and kind of designed the visual storytelling of the scenes. So it was interesting in the sense that I was getting I was able to delegate a little bit more of that side of it.
More leadership stuff coming in for you.
Yeah. I was living in the spreadsheets more, and less in the kind of random bits of paper and Post-it notes stuck to the wall kind of.
Yeah, we don't talk about it as much as we should, but can you? And I assume this is going to also relate to Far Cry 2. Can you talk a little bit about narrative design? Because it's a bit of a weird discipline, and in my experience, every studio has their own slightly different, at least that I've worked at, slightly different definition. Yeah. And you just mentioned there that you were moving on evolutions, or evolution. I don't remember if it's plural, but anyway, you were moving into narrative design and you had a separate writer and such. So can you just give us a little bit of what that means?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because, I think even during some of those interviews that happened on Far Cry 2, I mentioned that I came to understand that narrative design was less about designing the story and more about being a game designer whose job it was to make sure that there was tight linkages between the kind of authored narrative and the kind of player experience story, like this player stories that would bubble up out of the game systems.
A ludonarrative consonance.
You could say that, yeah. Although I didn't have the term at the time because Clint hadn't created it yet. So, but yeah, I mean, and I think I wasn't thinking about it in kind of very broad terms. For me, it was more like I knew, and certainly Far Cry 2 demonstrated this brutally, right? Was if you don't, as a narrative designer or narrative director, if you aren't doing the shuttle diplomacy between animation, audio, cinematics, game design, level design, UX and UI, no one is. Yeah. Right. It's you could probably there's, I'm sure, if you're on, chapter 7 of a series, those systems can be a little bit on rails, but when you're building something from scratch, you absolutely need a human being that is checking to see how those dependencies are going to play out. And then also looking for opportunities, right? You're looking for ways in which the story can become more present and more a lot better aligned, and of course, complexifying all that is, as I'm sure will surprise no one who's worked in the business. Some parts of the game team are working super waterfall, right? They're it's like an linear assembly line of, we storyboarded the thing and then we drew this drawing, made the concept drawings, and then we sent it to the outsourcer and they sent us back the models, and now we rigged it and now we're animating it and here's, but whereas while everyone else is working in a hyper iterative recursive way, right? And the disconnect between those two things means that it's very, very easy for you to wake up one day and discover that all that super expensive content that spent months going through its pipeline no longer lines up with what's been done on level design, for example, or even in terms of game systems. So a big part of the job, and it's easier when your production cycle is way shorter, right? But a big part of the job was just keeping track of the things that could change, that would change the context of the narrative. And then making adjustments as needed, making cuts as needed.
Right.
And yeah, so that's kind of what and on Far Cry 2, I mean, I was just doing that, but writ large, because it was a true open world and the scale of it was so much bigger.
So what was that? What was that transition like? I mean, it sounds like you're juggling both to some degree, and then Far Cry 2's in pre-production and or probably even concept phase. Clint gave us some insight into sort of, his transition over to that from Splinter Cell and some of the early discussions about goals and things. But like, how did that, was the open world, shift something that you saw coming and agreed with and like excited about? Like what was that phase like?
Oh, yeah.
Pretty crazy to go for you of all people, because you came from Instincts.
Right. And it was funny because,
and film.
Yeah. Right. Where you have, ultimate control over how the end user is going to consume it. So what was interesting was I was sort of privy to the conversations that were going on early on in sort of preconception phase. And obviously because, I'd spent a good chunk of work on Far Cry and time on Far Cry Instincts having to kind of grapple with the limitations, like, okay, we can't do it this way. Let's you're sort of constantly pushing against the restrictions of that tech. So with Far Cry 2, because there was essentially a pretty substantial re-engineering of the underlying tech, and so we were able to kind of determine what some of the requirements were going to be for that engine. There was an opportunity to say we have these ambitions on the narrative side, and to all be honest, I think that Clint had done most of that lobbying by the time I got on board. So like I made it in time to attend, like I went to the conception workshop with the folks in editorial and Clint or the producer and a few other people. And, I had been briefed at this point on, okay, we're going to do it in Africa and here's the kind of core game loop. And, at that point, Clint, I think had put together what I consider to be a really important set of pillars for the game. One of which was that bullets are the basis for all player input, right? Because we weren't making an RPG. So, like we talked pretty quickly about the fact that like we're not going to have a kind of a conversation system, like a BioWare style combo system, right? It's not going to be that kind of game. It's not an RPG. It's a shooter. It's a shooter that just happens to have 360 degrees of approach in every conceivable encounter. And so one of the things but we still had this sense that in an open world with that level of degree of openness, one of the ambitions that we wanted to have was to make the narrative somewhat flexible structurally, right? And I think the way Clint had described it was, and I'm probably getting this wrong, but I'm going to sort of paraphrase it, is, when he went from like Splinter Cell 1 to Splinter Cell Chaos Theory, he was able to introduce a degree of programmatic narrative reactivity into the game at kind of like the low to mid level, which is to say the game would sort of acknowledge the fact that you had, gone through the door instead of, picked the lock and gone through the door instead of following the guard through the laser grid or whatever it was. And it would kind of reflect that. And, if you did it without knocking anybody out and completely ghosted it, there would be a sense that, the dialogue that you would hear would reflect that. That's a gross oversimplification. There was actually quite a bit more to it than that. But the point being that those things lived in the kind of moment to moment decision making of the player. Yeah. And with Far Cry 2, his thinking on that had expanded quite a bit to the point where he's like, I think there's an opportunity for us to allow the high level structure of the game to have that degree of modularity. And so we talked a lot about, this kind of, that the overarching structure of the game was going to be this kind of heart of darkness, like descent into madness, right? You're kind of following you're going up the river to find the Jackal kind of metaphor, right? And so there is this kind of sense of progression, but that along the way were these kind of big acts, that would sort of follow what he called the Yojimbo model, where, you have the two factions on either end of the town and you're kind of playing both ends against the middle. And this, this sort of Red Harvest plot line, if you want to go all the way back to Dashiell Hammett. And it's, and that would, and you would be kind of doing that loop as a way of making your way down the river. Right. And so what that led us to was this idea that, that the player needed to kind of maximize certain meters that we were tracking for them in order to hit a threshold where they would be able to advance to the next step in that process, right? You would start out in this town, you'd be interacting with the factions at kind of like the lieutenant level. They would be encouraging you to do jobs for them. You would, over time, by talking to your buddies, learn how to subvert those jobs in order to kind of maximize the amount of destruction that you were causing, amount of chaos you were creating. And then that would accelerate you sort of further up the hierarchy, so now you're dealing with the captains of the factions and then eventually these warlords. And that this was what you needed to do in order to eventually, to expose the Jackal and get to him, which of course turns out to be kind of a vain struggle in a way for the player, because the Jackal isn't ultimately there's no boss fight against the Jackal. It's a confrontation with something else. So, and so that was kind of the very first set of conversations that we'd had when I joined, was like, what sort of modularity can we build into that storyline? If the player has the choice of going to either faction in any order, then that we have to support that a certain way. If the player can have X number of buddies and can potentially like exploit all of them in a particular part of the world, what does that look like? How do we manage the numbers so that there's the right number of permutations that are available to the player? I'm sorry, right now my description sounds very jumbled, but those were what the early conversations were like, right?
Yeah, well, you describe them as modular, which I don't think we use that word, but I think it's a good way to describe them. And then, when it comes to the concept of getting a mission or having a mission and then having different options for which mission you take at which time, like what did you have influences that were you pulling from RPG quests, or was that just coming from the modularity goal, or, how did you, because as we talked about with Clint and we talked about on the series, there wasn't a shooter structured like this really out there. And, how did you, was it just the modularity goal of like, how do we achieve this? Because the missions really were what ended up being the driving force for that, right?
Yeah. I think part of it was a reaction to, the fact that we were making an open world shooter, and we understood what typical first person shooter structure was like, in the sense that we could look at a Halo, or we could look at at that point, I think we could have looked at like Call of Duty 2, for example, or the Battlefield series, to keep it grounded. And I think, so we had this sense of how linear shooters that were corridor shooters typically played out. And I think there was this sense that if we are throwing off the shackles for the player, putting the player into a world filled with violence, and then giving them the latitude to go anywhere they want to in that world, then in a sense, that freedom needs to exist in time as well as in space, right? So that means that the order in which they're taking on these things is highly, highly fluid. Which I think is broadly true most of the time in the Far Cry series, but in our case, I think we probably dialed it up to 11 because we thought that this would be important, because we didn't really have a good reference to work from, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So the idea that you could talk to either faction and do those jobs in either order but that there was a little bit of a collapse. Like the waveform would kind of collapse at the end of each act, so that you would sort of end up addressing each of the needs of the faction, no matter what. And then the variability came from whether you chose to do the more complex, the complication that the buddies would introduce into the mix. They would contact you after you were assigned the mission and then say, hey, I hear you're going to go, you're going to go take out that special forces team in the desert. We should have a talk about that, and then they would come up with this elaborate way for you to undermine those guys that put you in more risk, and also obviously put your buddy in play. And so a lot of our early conversations, the terminology we were using was very much like anteing and wagering. It was like it's a hedge. You're putting a hedge on your overall success, but you're doing it by putting your buddies in greater risk.
Can I ask what the sort of intended counter pressure on the player is? Like, I think that's one thing that Tim, now of course Tim had Save Anywhere, which at the time he said that, it just kind of blew my mind, and I couldn't really respond in the moment to say, wow, that totally changes the game, because I'd never played it that way. Yeah. So my question, I guess, is like, what's the counter pressure to not doing the buddy missions? Because I know I did only the buddy missions the first time I played it, back in 2009 or whatever. Because I was shipping a game in 2008 at the same time you were.
Right. So and again, I think there's probably some depth to the economies that I'm going to gloss over because it's been a while since I thought about it. But sure. But basically, by cooperating with the buddies, you are accelerating the rate at which you increase your infamy. And as you may have noted, like, your infamy is a thing in the game. It's exposed to the player. Like, you do have it. It does live in the non-diegetic parts of the UX. You can see it. And thresholding your infamy is the thing that ultimately accelerates you towards the end of the act. And so if you do the basic version, the vanilla version, if you will, of the faction missions, then you're not moving down that path as quickly. And in the meantime, your malaria is continuing to become an issue, and your access to the medicines that the civilians provide you is becoming an issue. And you're spending more time in that region of the world, kind of being exposed to the risks associated with that. When you go do the version that the buddies give you, you're you're speeding the process up, but you're doing it at the expense of placing your buddies at risk, and you, frankly, yourself, because those missions are by definition more dangerous.
Gotcha. Yeah. So I wasn't too far off when I was thinking about it. I'd forgotten about the infamy aspect.
Well, it's an important lesson that we learned.
It's not well exposed.
It's a little opaque.
About programmatic narrative, which is, and Clinton and I grappled with this quite a bit, and as did Jonathan Moran, who's like the mission designer, guy who went on to become the creative director on the Watch Dogs series. But we talked a lot about like if you make those kind of parameterized narrative elements too analog, then they become indistinguishable from random, right? You need them to be discrete enough that the player can discern the effect. So there's a kind of a step function to the experience. And there's, because again, we were all people who loved immersive sims, and, we were in love with, as you can see in the sort of diegetic approach we took, we were in love with the kind of feeling that you would get from games like Deus Ex or Thief, where you had this sense that these systems were just kind of bouncing off of each other in order to create interesting friction for the player. But the reality is, it's much more obvious and visible to the player when those things are happening in the kind of core moment-to-moment action game verbs. Right? When they only live in the parts that are narrative, where there's a low predictability, then the player is going to tend to see it as noisy, right? Or as I think the term I used to use a lot back then was stochastic. It's like becomes like this stochastic narrative that doesn't really feel like there's any, they can't predict it. They don't have a sense of, I can't build a strategy around this.
Yeah. I remember going to look at the infamy score. I think there's maybe your sickness level there too, and maybe some buddy stats. And I remember looking at it and I'm like, I wonder what that is. And I never really but Brett had theorized multiple times that there was some bar in the background filling that was going to progress things forward. And that was blowing my mind on like the fact that he probably was right. And now you're confirming that to be the case, but that wasn't exposed to me was blowing my mind. I was like, wait, what do you mean? Like, how do I move forward? Like what, so there was a cool factor to it because it was so like, I don't know. It's just the world. I'm living in the world and who knows how it's going to, like it's unexpected, but there's also like a usability side of like, man, I really wish I knew, because to your point on using the buddies options of escalation or not, I pretty much always did them. And so like the contrast between not doing them was not something I really experienced. So I didn't even think, you know what I mean? Like I just did them. And so I didn't have the comparison of what it would be like if I didn't. That's just how I ended up playing personally. So,
right.
Yeah. To take a much simpler sort of, version of this, to look at the Walking Dead series, the first Telltale one, those choices are kind of binary and clear in a sense of like, well, you're going to keep this person or this person alive. Like, and it doesn't really matter because of course everybody dies in a zombie narrative and you kind of know that. And I think that's probably what was a little hard to see was like, okay, I can see if I do the buddy thing, I'm increasing my buddy, rank and all that stuff. And like, that means better stuff in the safe houses.
Right.
But there wasn't a clear plus on the other side.
Yeah.
Right.
So,
yeah. I mean, I think, the main wager, as I think we talked about it, was it's putting your buddy in play, which means it's putting your buddy at risk, right? Yeah. It becomes a kind of a so there's a risk reward trade-off that you need to manage, and part of it is an assessment of how dangerous you think the mission's going to be and how chaotic and unpredictable and prone to those kind of systemic setbacks, which really are what define the low-level experience of Far Cry 2, right? It's the carefully laid plan that will absolutely go awry because you couldn't have anticipated that a water buffalo was going to come stampeding by and get hit by a truck and trigger a reaction from the guards, or that a flaming tire from your last combat was going to come rolling down the hill from outside of the streaming volume and set a propane tank on fire or whatever. Like those things were specifically designed that way to be volatile because it created an interesting forcing function on the player. And we always talked about how if the systems cause you to have to abandon your plans and run away, then we failed. If the systems cause you to have to alter your plan or modify your plan so that you can kind of continue to do what you were planning, what you wanted to do, then we've succeeded. And so that's where an enormous amount of tuning went into sort of trying to find the sweet spot in the volatility of the environment and in the missions. But yeah, so like you walk into those buddy missions, the buddy escalations, if you will, knowing that those are probably more volatile than the normal ones. And so there's a greater risk that you will be wounded and go down. And since, as you pointed out, we're not a game typically where you're going to reload. And then that will cause the buddy to come in and rescue you, but now they're exposed. Yeah. And so you guys can fight together, but now there's a greater likelihood of them. In this kind of XCOM style way, you're sort of evaluating, like, do I want my buddy to be put in danger in this situation or not?
Yeah. Brett had also mentioned, because if you had listened to the episode, you know that I didn't get, I didn't play in a way, and I didn't get far enough to where the buddies were at that level of connection for me.
Right.
But in retrospect, the save anywhere on PC is a real deal breaker, I think, for some of this stuff, for me at least, because though I didn't necessarily grow as attached and kind of go through that full loop of losing lots of buddies as I think, I should have, I did really want to protect them when they were in play. And so what you're talking about as far as a goal goes, like I was seeing that goal coming because I would like reload. I would like, no, I'm not going to lose anybody, but that's not really what the point was. It's like I shouldn't have been able to reload and,
Right.
and I should have, and it was about embracing those decisions and consequences of those decisions if I do put one in play. So it's really interesting listening to both you and Clint talk about the game. And a lot about our podcast is about takeaways for us of like playing a game and like, what do we learn and what maybe does the audience learn and what did you learn? But like, something as simple as the decision of making a save system more usable because you can on the PC, and the repercussions of something that simple. Seemingly like, of course we would. Why wouldn't we give the player more options? And I think Clint kind of mentioned like there was a debate about that, and maybe people lost that debate. But it weirdly for me, I think changes the buddy system and the way that what you're talking about the goals.
Yeah. I think I think it's safe to say that almost every choice in the game is kind of like that. Like the fact that we, our regenerating health bar is segmented, right?
Yeah.
So that you only regenerate within a particular segment. That conversation followed around the same, like was really tied into this, to achieving the same dynamic. It's like there needs to be that kind of sense of pressure. It's not a you're going to go hide behind the tree and everything and you're back to 100%.
Yeah.
Because you are constantly being asked to manage the tools by which you keep yourself in the fight, either the syringes or like you popping your malaria meds or whatever. So it's like, it's interesting. It's a kind of weird parallel to the larger discussion about like diegetic everything, right?
I'm curious. You mentioned the malaria. Did you? Because I questioned this during play. Like, did you programmatically choose tense moments to need to use the malaria pills?
So I am going to be very candid with you. I don't remember exactly what all the triggers were, because you're right that there is some triggering that happens.
Okay.
But it's additive to or multiplicative, I guess, to something that's much more systemic.
Gotcha.
But yeah, there is a degree to which it is.
It just makes it that much more likely that it's going to happen.
Yeah, but
when you're getting chased by 6 guys.
Yeah, I'm going to not do a shitty job of guessing what that system was.
Yeah, sure.
I just don't.
Yeah. No, but I wanted to make sure that I wasn't crazy about that, because being on my second playthrough, I kind of like I see more now, right, than I saw the first time, which is an argument sometimes for not replaying a game, but yeah, okay. I that one came right to mind as soon as you said the malaria, and it's like, oh yeah, that's right, you got to manage the malaria. So tell me about that. Sorry, I totally interrupted, but I had to know.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because like I can even tell you like in the earlier kind of, I would say all the way through pre-production, we had an even more robust set of meters running below the hood for the factions, in the sense that you would the missions that you were doing were designed to lower global values for things like health and morale and the reliability of weapons. And that gets back to that point I was mentioning about the player's expression. The player's tool for expression is bullets. So you would put bullets into the world, and a bullet that hits somebody obviously lowers their health. A bullet that misses somebody might reduce their morale and cause them to break. And a bullet that hits the ground near them or hits cover would generate debris that would lower the reliability of the weapons. I mean, that was the original model that we talked about for that.
Holy cow.
And it became and then that was at the micro level, right? And then at the macro level was the idea that you could lower the global values for the faction that all of their individual AI inherited when they were instantiated if you did certain kinds of missions. So like a mission to, steal medicine from their infirmary would like lower their global health. A mission to, sabotage their, the motor oil or something would lower the reliability of their vehicles. So that was the original thinking on that. And there was a whole set of player stories that would emerge from it. But the truth is we had to simplify it, right? Like it was not easily parsed to begin with.
Yeah.
Never mind the giant, debug effort that would have to go into making that work, right?
Yeah, it's probably already a balancing nightmare.
Yeah.
And then adding, a dozen more variables. I mean, it does not just add. It's not a simple plus.
It's grossly inflationary, right?
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah.
But it does speak. It does speak to the simulation sensibilities, though, that I think the game has always been tagged with, of like trying to. And Metal Gear 5 does a little bit of this as well, if you played that. But
right.
Or V, as the fans say, myself. But anyway, sorry, I had to. But I mean, I think the other thing we try to do on the podcast is talk about, how a particular game has influenced the future. And even though, like you said, you had to simplify for various reasons, production and otherwise, I think that sensibility has lived on for sure. And there's games that do dabble in those sorts of like global systems and players' impact on them in a positive way. I mean, there's also a survival element to this game. Like you mentioned segmented health, you mentioned, and I love the bullets as economy and as conversation, which is sort of a little dark to say, but or very dark to say, but something that Brett and I debated a lot, and we talked a lot about friction, and we talked about that with Clint. But like, at the core, it's a shooter, and, that makes sense. And you have to kind of like embrace the fact that that is your main interaction with everything, that's what it is. And once you do that, I think part of my problem was I was imposing to other things that really didn't really belong. But anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, there's a certain element in a game that has that much kind of emergent sort of, the anecdote factory stuff that Clint mentioned. Then we used to talk about how, like, if you do that well, you are offloading some of the computational burden from the game and onto the player brain, right? Because the player starts to impose or project narrative meaning on events that have not been scripted and that haven't been authored, right? They start to see it as, and I remember at the time, I think maybe one of my GDC talks was about this, where, we talked about how like people could be playing a sports game, which is like kind of like the least formally narrative genre, probably, other than maybe puzzles. And yet they are carrying around with them this sense of, it's the story of my season with my team and how we were the underdogs and we came back from being behind, and blah, blah. And it has more emotional heft for them than pretty much any scripted story would, right? And so I think, we talked a lot about the power of the systems in Far Cry 2 to produce that effect. And the more we can rely on that, obviously, the better. It was more engaging, and players have this tendency to like, there's a reason why people will occasionally write out like these sort of documentary style accounts of their experiences in that game, right? Because it sort of produces those effects pretty liberally.
It's pretty incredible. As we're sort of winding out our hour here. Are there, I think you've probably organically shared a bunch of these throughout the conversation, but are there things that you carry, that's the usual question toward the end of an interview? Like, are there things from Far Cry 2 that you carry today with you that, are kind of like, I don't know, evergreen, or something that's just like a fundamental, thing that you still you still learned here and still, benefits and helps you day to day?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was instructive in a few ways. One is I have come to understand both through my experiences on Far Cry 2 and also my subsequent experiences on Splinter Cell, which is another game where, they're particularly for AI, because I one of the weird tangents that I ended up investing a lot of energy on Far Cry 2 was in AI design, just because we had like non-combat areas, like essentially the part of the AI that isn't shooting at you, was really heavily narratively implicated, right? So, and it's this kind of awareness of just how hard it is to get parseable human reactions that, and not just because of animation and facial expressions and all these kinds of things, but like just the tempo at which players are moving around in the environment and the proximity at which they are observing the behavior of your NPCs means if you want things to unfold diegetically, if you want the player to be using their normal human behavioral mapping to read the game conditions, the challenge invariably is it just in distance and kind of the amount of information, those kind of weird, like unconscious cues that we all pick up on in real life, how much of that is available to the player. And so that was a big thing. It was just how hard it is to deliver that and how coarse it has to be. It's like the difference between acting in theater on a stage where people in the cheap seats need to understand it versus acting for film where there's a camera in your face and you're in extreme close up. Right. So that was something that I think I took away with it. The other one is, most of the games I've worked on since have had an element of sandbox play to them, even if the sandboxes were small, but in some cases the sandboxes are fairly decent sized. And so it was a way of thinking about approach, and about the player, where the tension is coming from. So like in Far Cry 2, especially working with John, I mentioned John Moran, we had this kind of pie slice approach where we would look at these shells that sort of sat concentrically around an objective. And there was this sense of you enter each of those shells and you're kind of in an approach stage, or you're in this kind of decompression stage where you're observing and you're trying to figure out what your plan is going to be. And that's usually where the interesting improvisation kicks off, like where something comes in and fucks your plan up so that you're forced to, pivot. And then within that, you have this next sort of maneuver shell, which is like where you start figuring out where your cover is, or how you're going to, conceal your movement, or whatever it is, or where the exploding tank is. And then in the middle, of course, is where the main objective is, and where you're typically going to get a high density of enemies. And so it's like thinking about that sort of encounter design, 360 degrees of encounter design, was something that was hugely educational for me, because it was trying to take the corridor model, but obviously, integrate it in a big loop around the objective. And that's something that, even today, like even on Gotham Knights, which we just shipped, when I would work with the level designers on open world, we would talk a lot about, doing a pass on location as well as doing a pass on the setup for the encounter for like a particular crime, for example, to make sure that, the player always had a chance to kind of get their bearings and figure out what their approach was going to be before we drop them into the fight. Or if they're going to try to be stealthy, making sure that they understand that what affordances there are for that.
Yeah,
that is a great thing to think about. Like you have to know the place from every side as you build it. Like to really, really know it and know that you're delivering. That's cool. And also a good segue to something we wanted to talk about towards the end here, which was that you just shipped Gotham Knights. Congratulations.
Thank you. I'm a little shell shocked, but yes, thank you very much.
Yeah, we know that feeling well.
Yeah.
We were talking about it in pre-show. There's this moment after. Well, you should probably describe it rather than me. How are you feeling?
Yeah,
not that there's one way you're feeling, but how are you feeling?
Right, it's the it's the inevitable emotional kind of whiplash that comes from after you've been in sort of hyper intensive closing mode, and you've been every, the kind of micro level, high tempo decision making, that at the end is usually heavily triaged, so that when everything you're saying is theoretically, improving the game by some tangible amount, measurable amount. And then you go from that intense sort of tempo decision making to none of that. now you are effectively a passive observer of what happens next. You might have decisions, in my case, I guess I could distract myself by kind of diving into offering support on, the communication and marketing side of it, the evangelizing side of it. But there is that weird vacuum, and it can lead to depression. And, for anyone out there who is a new game developer who has finding themselves in the first project, getting close to the close, my advice to you is to be ready for that. Like, have a plan, have some hobbies in place, even if you're not going to immediately take time off. Have something you can shift your focus onto semi-obsessively, so that you aren't left feeling like you're staring out at like an empty sports arena after doing the show of your life, kind of thing, right? And I think I'm fortunate in the sense that I guess I get to start thinking about the next project probably as early as anybody, right? So I've at least been able to put myself into that, but make no mistake about it. It's very very, very different being in early conception phase or preconception phase or pitch phase on a thing is very, very different from being in closing modes, and emotionally, psychologically, and every other respect. So it's like, hydrate, get plenty of sleep, try to find some exercise. I don't know, like all the normal stuff, I guess.
Yeah, those are all good things. I mean, you go from knowing exactly what you should be doing,
right,
probably moment to moment, especially in a sort of producer-driven atmosphere, as closing very much is. Like, literally, this is what you can work on right now.
Right.
To like, you can now do anything. Like, your time is your own, and it's like, people would think that was remarkably freeing. I think not, if they haven't been through it. But it's actually just. It's just, I don't know. It definitely hit me the first time, the first couple times really. And then I kind of realized, oh, that's why. Like, I'm totally shifting gears here. Like, I'm not even on gears anymore.
Right.
Like, now I'm gearless.
Right.
And so it's just, it's a weird, fascinating feeling.
Yeah. And I mean, I think this could be said of probably a lot of different human endeavors, right? It's like, you really start to enjoy the kind of camaraderie of working closely with a bunch of people, like a large number of people, on solving problems. And you kind of, even when things get intense, assuming that the production structure is responsible and not exploitative, of course. I'm not talking about like endless crunch and burning people out, but I'm just talking about like what you would consider the healthy version of it, which I think we got, actually. And it's still, you start to get a little hooked on that feeling of like, like us as the team working together to tackle these things. And then the band breaks up, in a sense. Like, even if it doesn't break up, it's gonna, it dissipates. That energy dissipates. You're not all pointed in the same direction.
You're in the off season. Except our seasons are multiple years long.
Right.
So it's intense. Well, thanks so much, Patrick. This has been really elucidating, illuminating, and really great to hear. I don't think we've had sort of somebody who's been so deep into the narrative design as an interview yet. I'm trying to think back if that's true.
No,
I mean,
I don't
sort
think
of the
this
adventure
flavor.
games in a way, but not this style. This more systemic narrative design.
Yeah, it's funny. I in hindsight, I don't know how much actual narrative design I talked about, but as with, as we were talking about with Far Cry 2, it's interesting because it's not an RPG, or even like a sort of action adventure in the kind of Uncharted sense. You're not enacting a specific chronology. Talking about the narrative of Far Cry 2 is talking about all of those other systems. It's talking about the AI. It's talking about the these kind of economies that are with varying degrees of visibility. It's talking about kind of like structural choices as well. But
that's why I wanted to bring it up, because when I asked you to dive into it a little bit, especially for Far Cry 2, but also just in general, because I think, not only is narrative design relatively newish in as far as like a discipline, and also like we talked about, different based on every project really, and within studios, I think a lot of people come into the assumptions about narrative designers as just writers. Yeah. And I think something that you and Brett and I have all had conversations with people on teams of, or people who are interviewing for that job or whatever, is like, this isn't a writer. Right. This is, this is, in most cases, sometimes it is, and sometimes they will write, and oftentimes they could write, but it is, like you said, I think you did a great job at like giving people an understanding of an extreme different, different flavor of what narrative design really can be on a systemic, definitely open world sandbox game. Yeah. And, and I think you're a great example of sort of the diplomacy, if you will, or the connective tissue, sort of like technical designers in a way, where they're connecting, design and tech and art all together to make sure that everything's working. And narrative designers are the same thing for any narrative element to it. And it's just it's a very hard thing to describe to people. And I think an unsung hero too of games like this that I think a lot of the audience doesn't fully always know about. So
I think you put it as well as I could have. I mean, like this is a deep topic, I think, for anybody who's been involved with the narrative side of it. So, I mean, I feel like I'm at risk. If I start talking about it again, like we're going to be here for another.
Yeah, we'll be here for another hour, for sure.
But
but I thank you. Yeah. Thanks for even attempting it.
Thank you guys for having me.
Welcome back from the break. It's a pleasure to get a second guest on for an episode. It's always nice to hear another perspective.
Yeah, definitely good, and very fortunate that we got Patrick on, and especially because he was talked about so much, and thanks to Clint for connecting us. So kind of one thing led to another there, and I didn't get a chance to circle back around to it, but Patrick's opener about his science background, I thought, was really an unexpected, cool aspect of things that basically like couched everything a little bit, because when he was talking about and describing things like systems, I've always thought systems designers were a bit of scientists, in a weird, alchemical way. Obviously not officially trained as scientists, but there's a sense of the scientific method, if you will, or, the sort of approach of how you try to break things down into fundamental parts and all those sorts of things. And so it's kind of made sense when he said that, it's like, oh yeah, you kind of need to think that way to do some of the things that he's done.
Yeah, that's definitely true. There was a definite reflection there, since I also started coding basic from magazines into books and got a physics undergrad degree.
It was
as well as philosophy.
It was
weird echo.
Yep, it was very nostalgic hearing him say that. Like, somebody else has
split.
said that.
He went to design, and I went to tech. Mm-hmm. So I went and did my grad school and didn't learn much about programming, but learned some, enough to get me by the Guardians and into the industry. So it all worked out, and here I am. But yeah, I mean, I am glad we got to talk, and we talked even a little bit again afterwards about narrative design and how that works in a game, like Far Cry 2, and there were so many aspects of that I hadn't really considered. Although I, reflecting on it, I've definitely heard it before about the sort of having to go and sort of cajole every department into like making things line up. It's like you're trying to redraw the blueprint for the narrative, as you get in the girders, right, for your bridge, so that both ends meet up, except that there's like 6 different ends that have to meet up in one place,
Mm-hmm.
So it was really interesting to hear about that. And that was the time where we weren't that far into having writers at that point. So, and then to go and be stepping into a narrative design and basically starting to define that role, that's really, it was definite time, for sure.
Yep, absolutely.
So, yeah, really
good.
Really great to hear about that, and to learn more about the systemic underpinnings and kind of pick at some of those specific questions we had about how those things were supposed to work together, and have their ludonarrative consonants, as it were. So all good. So
nice.
I definitely wish him well with recovery as well. It's a little bit of reality about game development. We just happen to have him literally 2 days after his game comes out. We don't his most recent game, obviously. We don't often get that, and that's definitely a time. It is, it's something I feel like we've maybe touched on it before, but it's definitely that, he put that postpartum depression of like, yep, you just went through a thing and now everything has changed in your day-to-day work. And he's right. Having, I've sat at tables with, people who are shipping their first game and are like scouring the message boards and like having, emotional mood swings because they don't know what else to do with their time. And it's like, okay, and talk to their leads, or if I am their lead, really invest in them, making sure that they have a healthy outlet for their sudden time and energy, and expectations, right, of like how their life is going to be, for the next little while. So it's a tricky time, especially your first one or two. So cool to, and it doesn't change. I mean, it's just, about it more, the longer you go on. You still feel it, but it's coming, and you can kind of be ready for it. I think, but it takes a couple before you realize what's going on there. So, or maybe you just run off and go become a ranger somewhere.
that can be an option. that could happen.
Sure.
Occasionally.
Flee to the woods
once. Yeah.
Maybe not
just
more than
flee.
once.
Just flee.
Just run away. Oh boy.
Yeah.
All right, cool. We haven't talked about this at all, and so I'm just going to spring it on you now. We have one recording day left in October. So of course it's time to start our scary game of the year.
Yeah, we didn't plan that out as well as we could have.
But, I didn't expect us to spend 5 weeks and 2 interviews on Far Cry 2, I have to say. Right. I mean, I just, we hope to get one, and then I didn't think we would spend 5 weeks on the game and a bonus, talking about more recent Far Cries. So, it just kind of like, we had a plan, and then we started getting into it, and suddenly the plan had to change. We just had to improvise. And so here we are at the end of October. And you've picked out a game, I believe.
Was it ultimately my decision? Yeah, maybe it was.
I think it was. Yeah.
So
you had
Dead Space, the original Dead Space. That's what we decided, right?
That is what we decided. Yes, that's good. It's good that you took a memo on your own.
My memo recorder. Dead Space 1, obviously quite a bit inspired by the remake that I think is coming out in early next year, maybe.
Supposedly in January, yeah.
Yeah, and I think it might have. I thought you and I had talked about it at some point, but I think it also came up on one of my streams. Somebody brought it up, or we were talking about Dead Space for some reason because of its, probably came up while playing Dark Souls for some reason. But anyway,
and we just want to stay in 2008.
Yeah, so. Right. It just keeps on trucking. So that's our Halloween spooky cast, which you will get the first episode of after Halloween is over.
That's how it's gonna work.
But still pretty relevant, I think. And we may even have primed up next year's Halloween as our second choice as well, if we get that far, which is also due for a remake. But we'll tell you about that next year. So Dead Space, if you're interested, prime that up.
My question is, have you played this one before?
I have, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
I'm gonna guess I didn't finish it though. I feel like, well, maybe I did actually. I think I did finish this one, but it's been, I played it when it came out.
It's got a good spooky ending. I like this one. It's got a good. It's unsettling, and it's a great, it's a great setting. The Ishiguro, I think, is the name of the ship. But,
that sounds familiar.
Something along those lines. Yeah. It's cool, and it has a lot of interesting things to talk about. In terms of sort of being a shooter that's not quite a shooter, because the shooting is a little different, and what you're targeting is different from normal shooters. So there's that switch. There's a lot of. It'll be interesting to play that back to back with a open world shooter. Now we'll go to more of a corridor shooter, but with different, where they're going in a different direction. So
we'll talk.
It's an interesting place to play it. Yeah,
we'll talk a lot about Resident Evil 4, I'm sure, right? And of the Anyway, we'll get into it. I think the other thing that I forgot to mention is highly relevant in the case of Callisto Protocol as well, which is coming out this soon.
I don't know.
It's coming out. I thought it was coming out this fall, but maybe they pushed that out too. But which is X Dead Space, folks.
Yeah, we'll be finishing this right about when it.
Okay, so it's doubly relevant then.
Directed by Glenn Schofield.
Who
created Dead Space. Okay, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it's.
I didn't realize he was involved in that as well. So okay, cool. Yeah, that'll be.
Striking Distance is. He's a co-founder of, so that's basically a spiritual sequel to it, etc. We have some mutual acquaintances too. So we, fingers crossed, we might even be able to get guests on or a guest. So
yeah, for sure,
exciting,
for sure. All right, cool. Well, in the meantime, you can shoot us reviews. We do have one that's sitting in the hopper that we're going to have to read one of these days. But with the interviews, we try to just kind of go out with an outro instead of delving into the mailbag, because it starts opening up all kinds of other questions. You can shoot questions to devgameclub@gmail.com. You can find us on the web at devgameclub.com, on Twitter at devgameclub, where you can find my co-host at
Tim Longo Jr. with the JR at the end.
Though he's not streaming from the bed of chaos tonight, he is normally streaming over at twitch.tv/Tim Longo Jr. with the JR at the end. And you're still behind those golden doors.
Yeah. I don't know. I got to some boss called the Bed of Chaos, and I actually did look this one up because I was like, is this... am I behind a golden door right now? Like, I don't remember going behind a golden door in this case. I guess I just...
This is the one that's underneath the lava, where the lava
is. Yeah. And I killed a couple bosses down there as well. I got the ring and everything, so... the lava ring. But, it's... Yeah. I don't know. I mean, what do you say about this game? Really, it's like I'm just so
it just keeps going is what you say about it. It just keeps going. Yeah. It's extraordinary. So you're getting there. I think you haven't done the one in the Tomb of Giants. So
that's right. That's the last, other than the Abyss, which scares me so much that
you went to the Abyss.
I went there once, and I was like, I'm not going to go back. I'm not going back.
Okay. I guess you're not finishing this one. Okay.
I know. And then
our intro.
Anyway.
Go. All right. Our intro and outro music was written and performed by Kirk Hamilton, commissioned by friend of the cast Aaron Evers, and our logo, of course, and our store are by Mark Garcia. You can find a link to the store in the pinned tweet, the second pinned tweet on our Twitter feed. Have fun reaping your red harvest this week, and good night.
I like what you did there. Good night.